one of the most important responsibilities of governments in the modern world is to provide a quality public education for their citizens. There is probably no more important responsibility when it comes to preparing a modern economy to succeed, right, than having a well-educated population. So how do you ensure that your education system is of the highest possible quality? Well, after several generations of research, we've come to a much better understanding of this. We used to think that it was simply a matter of spending enough money on education or making classes small enough or building schools. Now we understand more and more that the most critical person in the whole education equation is the teacher. Good teachers make an enormous difference in how good an educational system is. To give you an example of this, a teacher in the 80th percentile will teach your child a year and a half's material in 1 year. A teacher in the 20th percentile will teach your child half a year's material in 1 year. That is a difference of a full year of learning in 1 year between a very good teacher and a mediocre teacher. That is enormous. That is astronomically large. Right? And what that says is the primary responsibility of a government in the modern age is to figure out a way to maximize the quality of teachers in the classroom. Right? Now, how do we do that? Well, in the past generation or so, there has been a whole move throughout the world to what's called value-added metrics. Value-added metrics simply say what we do with a teacher is, at the beginning of every school year, we measure the performance of the children in that classroom. Say we give them all a reading test, and we see where they fall. Are they in the 60th percentile as a group? And then at the end of the year, we measure them again. And if they now fall in the 50th percentile as a group, we see that that teacher has had a -10 effect on the class, has moved them back 10 percentile points. If they now fall in the 70th percentile, we say that teacher is a +10 and is the kind of teacher who can move our students ahead. I've grossly simplified how that works, but that describes how we are around the world measuring the quality of teachers increasingly. And if you look in various countries that have adopted value-added metrics, you can see they have become increasingly important. We're using them to drive hiring decisions, firing decisions, to decide how much to pay people, whether to promote people. Parents are using those measures to decide what schools they want to go to or what teachers they want for their children. They have become extremely important. They have defined what people think of as the responsibility of government in the educational world. Now, what have we learned very recently, though, about value-added metrics? Well, we've learned that the problem is a good deal more complicated. So, for example, what we've discovered is that value-added metrics are incredibly variable. So for example, there are all kinds of different ways, different algorithms that can be used to measure a teacher's value-added score. They all have they're based on the same idea, but they have subtle differences. What happens if I use a different algorithm to try and measure a teacher's quality? What happens is you see that a teacher will go from being ranked as one of the best to ranked as mediocre. Right? Incredible movement. What happens if I measure a teacher in different subjects? So I want to know how good a mathematics teacher is at teaching mathematics. So I measure them in their calculus class, and I get a score for them. What happens if I measure them in their algebra class? Will those two scores correspond? The answer is they won't. A teacher can be seen as a brilliant teacher of algebra, but a terrible teacher of calculus. Most important, what happens if I measure a teacher's quality over different years? What if I compare my score as a teacher this year with my score as a teacher last year? What I discover is there are huge swings from year to year. A teacher who can be seen as superb in 1 year can have a terrible score the next year. Now, any kind of measure that's trying to assess the quality of performance that's that variable is a problem. It's highly problematic, right? How do you have any faith in that? So what's the reason for that high variability? The reason is that good teaching, we now understand, is about an interaction between a teacher and a student, right? You can't take the student out of the equation. That students are responding to a certain kind of teacher teaching a certain kind of subject in a certain kind of situation. The reason that teachers can have scores that are really high one year and really low the next is that their students have changed. And one teacher can be fantastic at teaching a room full of very, very capable students from well-educated backgrounds and be very poor at teaching a classroom of students who are not that capable from poor backgrounds, and vice versa. Some teachers can be fantastic at teaching poor students and not very good at teaching highly capable students. Now think about what that fact means for the role of government. It used to be the case that if you were trying to build a quality educational system, you were solving a puzzle. You were just deciding, where do I spend resources? And you would collect information about teachers and you would say, oh, I need to hire that person and fire that person. Now that we understand, though, that good teaching is about an interaction between a teacher and a particular pupil, the task of managing and creating an effective school has gotten an order of magnitude harder. All of a sudden now we are faced with a much more complicated task. We have to simultaneously measure the quality of teachers and the quality of students. We have to figure out how they intersect, and then we have to arrange schools such that there is the best possible fit between the person at the front of the classroom and the person in the classroom. That is not easy. That requires negotiations with teachers, with parents, constant monitoring of students. More than that, it requires that we shift from thinking about students as groups to thinking about students as individuals. It requires that the educational system no longer think about serving a classroom of students, but it requires the educational system to start saying, how does this student differ from that student, and relate to this teacher or that teacher or that teacher? When you understand the problem of education as a mystery, you understand that the role of the government has profoundly changed. They are now in the business of providing individualized, personalized solutions and not group solutions. Let me give you another example of this particular shift. There was a really interesting paper that came out a couple weeks ago by a group of public health experts at the Bloomberg School in at Johns Hopkins University in the United States. And they were looking at life expectancy. And they made the observation, they were comparing life expectancy gains in every decade since the 1950s, all around the world. And they observed that in the 1950s and 1960s, there were huge increases in life expectancy in virtually every country in the world. But since then, over the last 20 years or so, those gains have slowed dramatically, and even in some cases have gone into reverse. Now the question is, why is this happening? Well, you might say, well, it makes sense, because now that we've raised average life expectancy so high, we're now coming up against the natural biological limits of the human lifespan. You would expect the gains to slow. And that's true in part. But then the researchers point out that the biggest slowdown in life expectancy increases are in the countries that have the lowest life expectancy, right? The group of countries that have life expectancy of below 51 years are the ones who've seen the biggest slowdown. That has nothing to do with natural biological limits to how long you can live, right? That's a whole different problem. Okay, you might say, well, maybe this is simply a statistical consequence of this very unusual thing that happened in the world in the 1980s and 1990s, which was the AIDS epidemic, right? And they say, the researchers say, yes, that's true. But turns out that even in countries that largely escaped the brunt of the AIDS epidemic, we see the same pattern, right? So it's not the AIDS epidemic. Then you might say, well, maybe it's because in the last 20 or 30 years, we have been spending less and less on healthcare. Totally not true. We've been spending more and more. What about maybe it's the case that in the last 20 years, we have had a real slowdown in medical innovation, right? Not true. The opposite is true. The last 20 years have been a golden age of medical innovation, right? So what's the reason for this puzzling change? Why have it's one of the most disturbing facts about the modern world that all of a sudden the tremendous gains that we made in the post-war era are slowly coming to a halt and in many cases being reversed. The answer is that the nature of the problem that we face when it comes to providing quality healthcare to our citizens has changed, right? In the 1950s, if you were trying to solve the problem of making your population healthier, it was a puzzle. What you needed to do was to provide more resources, buy more drugs, build more hospitals, hire more doctors. It was fairly straightforward. But now we're dealing with a problem that is a mystery. It's a good deal more complicated. And it's not caused by, in many cases, by a lack of resources. In many cases, it's caused by an excess of resources, right? Think about a problem, possibly one of the most serious medical healthcare problems facing the world today, which is diabetes. The problem that is exploding in every corner of the world. I think the number of diabetes deaths is expected to double around the world between now and 2030. And the cost of diabetes to healthcare systems, as I'm sure all of you know, is astronomical. This is the thing that's going to bankrupt us. What is diabetes caused by? It is caused by changes in lifestyle. It's brought about by affluence. It's about increasingly sedentary habits and increasingly rich diets that are causing people to have people's physiology to spiral out of control in ways we could never have imagined. And how do you solve the problem of diabetes being out of control? Well, you can make some inroads by spending more, by buying more drugs and hiring more physicians and building more hospitals. But fundamentally, the problem that you face is that you have to convince your population to change their lifestyle, to eat better and to exercise more. And that's not easy. That requires that you learn how to motivate people. That requires that you understand their psychology, that you speak to them from a position of credibility and trust, that you reach into their individual hearts and motivate them in ways that governments aren't used to doing. Tackling modern healthcare problems requires that governments behave in ways that they have never behaved before and learn to speak to people in a way they've never had to speak to them before. One last example. Many of you remember last summer there was that cyber attack in Europe, the WannaCry cyber attack, which has the effect of shutting down the British healthcare service, crippling FedEx's operations Federal Express's operations in Europe. It ended up affecting, I think, 300,000 computer systems in 150 countries. And in many cases, people were required to pay ransoms to get their systems up again, working again. You know, this is an example of something that is becoming increasingly common, right? This ransomware or whatever cyber attacks, whatever phrase we use to describe it. And what is interesting about it is that it represents a fundamentally novel kind of risk. We're used to the idea that somebody would go into a bank and rob that bank. We're used to the idea of theft that takes place on a individualized, case-by-case basis. This is structural theft. This is theft that affects an entire system across national boundaries. We've never really faced that kind of crime before, right? It's a completely unfamiliar kind of risk. Or think about what's going to take place in the coming decade when we move to autonomous vehicles. Virtually everyone considers the move to autonomous vehicles as inevitable, right? That's where we're all headed. And what autonomous vehicles will do is they will greatly reduce the amount of accidents that are due to human error, right? That's the great advantage. But they bring with them a new, completely novel kind of risk, and that is the risk that comes from some kind of third-party interference. Your car now becomes an object that can be hacked by an outsider, right? And if you want to be terrified, have a conversation with someone in the autonomous vehicle business about how they intend to defend against hacking threats to automobiles. And their answer is, we don't really know, right? We have an entirely new kind of risk on the horizon that we've not coped with before. Now, I could go down the list and talk about the number of novel risks that are lurking on the horizon in our world. Think about climate change. For millennia, we have dealt with the fact that the weather is highly variable, that we have droughts and floods, that we have hurricanes, that we have all kinds of ups and downs in the weather. And we've developed institutions to deal with them. Private insurance, public insurance. We have found a way to make the unpredictable predictable, and it's worked really well. But now we have climate change coming along, and climate change is a kind of unpredictability that we have never seen before, that we cannot properly model or account for, and which our institutions, our insurance institutions, don't know how to deal with. This is an entirely novel kind of risk, right? Now, will we develop ways of dealing with these novel risks? I'm sure we will. But I think we all have to understand what kind of threat these sorts of novel risks face, right? Novel risks are profoundly upsetting and anxiety-producing for the public. You know, last year around the world, 1.25 million people died in automobile accidents. That is a terribly high number, and that is 1.25 million individual tragedies. But none of those automobile accidents caused fundamental breakdown in societies, right? Why? Because we've been dealing with the risks of automobiles for over 100 years. We understand why they happen, and we understand what we can do to prevent them. But all of a sudden, if you have a situation where someone hacks into a tractor trailer driving at 70 miles an hour down a highway and causes a 100-car pileup and 200 people die, that's a kind of risk we haven't seen before. And that's going to be profoundly terrifying. Similarly, if we wake up one day and Miami and Mumbai and countless other coastal cities are underwater, right? That is going to be, and millions of people are displaced and billions of dollars in real estate is lost. That is going to be profoundly upsetting to people in a way that we've never seen before. And what will that require of government? That will require that government play a very different role than it's had to play in the past. Government's going to have to learn how to reassure people in a time of unusual anxiety, but how to reach out and to calm their fears and to convince them that our institutions are good enough to get us through this period, and to treat them and to think about them from a psychological perspective and not just as a recipient of resources or some kind of institutional mechanism. That is going to be really hard. Right? You know, we sometimes fall into the trap of thinking that as we move into an increasingly technologically sophisticated world, that all of this new data and algorithms and tools that are at our disposal are going to make the job of managing governments easier. And I think that is a mistake. That as we raise the sophistication of the tools and the data and the algorithms that surround us, we're going to have to simultaneously raise the sophistication of our social gifts in government. Governments are going to have to learn how to treat people as individuals. They're going to have to learn how to reassure people who are frightened, and they're going to have to learn how to motivate people to change their lives in meaningful ways. Right? That is the challenge that I think all governments around the world are going to face over the next generation. They're going to have to find a way to be more human. Thank you so much.